Hi, Ben Atkinson, author and director of holyclubs.com, where ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. In this case, this is a family devotion section. So ordinary families are called to do extraordinary things. And this is pre-foundation number 6, where we're talking about overcoming temptation. And so it's important, we've talked with your family about who the Father is and how much Jesus loves them and who Jesus is. We've talked about sin. We've talked about the cross. And we've talked about being a new creation. And now what we want to do is help them understand that temptations are going to come. It's really going to be something that they've got to continue to process, continue to go through. I like to, at this point in everything, is encourage you and with your parents, to have an open relationship with your children. I love the fact that my 7-year-old comes to me and shares what's wrong. My 6-year-old came to my wife and I and explained something that was wrong. There was something wrong in a store that we were in. It was really evil, and he came up and said, "Mom, Dad, this is wrong." There was a movie that the kids were going to watch, we as a family were going to watch, and the 6-year-old came up to me and whispered to me, "Dad, I hope you know that in this movie there's something that's not appropriate." Of course, he's saying our words back to us as parents, because we try to get them. Remember, there's 2 trees in the garden, and we try to explain them. We don't just tell them what's right and wrong. We want them to really search it out and figure it out for themselves. What is wisdom? And we're trying to train them. So when my 6-year-old comes up and says, this is something that's not appropriate, he's actually, I don't know, he saw a commercial for it or what have you. I don't know, we don't have TVs, so I don't know how it is. We were watching some family video, through the computer, and somehow he knew that was inappropriate, whether it was something inside his heart that was telling him, his conscience, the Holy Spirit, or something, and he knew. And it's important for us to train our children so that they'll choose what's right. And so let's talk about overcoming temptations. And in Firm Foundations, this is pre-foundation number 6, and we're on page 58. And so it says, no temptation has overtaken you. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. It says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with temptation will also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Honestly, you could just read that to your children and just kind of dialogue with them about it. Again, our Bible discussion section, it's important just to kind of walk them through that. If you just did that, you'd be okay. But step 1, we want them to be aware of temptation, goal number 1. And goal number 2, step 2, is we want them to overcome temptation. We want them to know that the enemy is going to be around. And listen, temptation, I'm going to read this real quickly. Temptation's an evil desire to do something that's foolish or unwise, which will result in harm to you and others. Remember, Satan tempted Eve by saying, "Did God really say?" So inward sin is birthed when you willingly think about something or envision how that particular temptation will benefit you. Remember, Eve thought about eating the fruit and how it would be good for her. So it's important for us to not only say there's an evil desire, and that's something that goes against God, that's foolish or unwise, and then we can sin inwardly. We want your children to know that they can sin when they're thinking about it. A lot of times, you'll see your kid, you'll tell them not to do something, they're kind of off in the corner just they're thinking about how it will benefit them. And we always kind of think sometimes that's cute, or look at that, or look what Junior's doing. Moms catch that usually right away. Dads were a little bit more dull. But that kid is sitting there in the corner thinking about whether they should obey or not. Perfect parenting moment to just kind of get in there and get down and look at them and say, "Hey, what are you thinking? What are you thinking about?" And they may tell you, they may not. A lot of times they'll share with you, And we want them to know that that's a place where the enemy's trying to get them to say, should I obey or shouldn't I? And when we choose not to follow the Lord, that's where inward sin is birthed. And why is this important? Why? Because later on, Jesus said, listen, if you think about murder, if you think about immorality, if you think about these things in your head, it actually is sin. So we want them to understand that there is this inward place of sin. And then outward sin happens when you willingly act upon the tragic temptation. Adam and Eve ate the fruit. And as a result, and then lastly, pain is a result that comes afterwards. But again, Adam and Eve were in the shame of their nakedness. Now, Satan's a deceptive, lying tempter. He just runs around. And it says with Jesus, he tempted him in the beginning, but then he said he left for a more opportune time. And so temptation comes when we're tired. Temptation comes at the end of the day. This is a good place to kind of jump in and talk about food. I'm pushing pause on the video, talking about what do you put into your children? What food do you put in? What rhythm of sleep cycles do you put in? How are you taking care of what is going into their ears? What is going into their eyes? Listen, if you're putting garbage into their food, if they're eating garbage, if they're not sleeping at a regular time, if garbage is going into their eyes, if garbage is going into their ears, it's going to be it's going to be hard to get them to walk through this. You've got to unplug them from the garbage food, from the garbage eye stuff, from the garbage ears. You've got to unplug them from that and plug them into the Lord. I remember a young man, he was maybe 4 years old, maybe 5 years old, and he would come into our children's prayer time. It was about an hour. This young man came in, and he would run all around the room. He was like, "Ah!" I mean, you couldn't control. His parents would just sit there, and his parents kind of were not really, they would just kind of sit there and be like, well, take care of my kid. What's wrong with you? And it was frustrating as a leader. And finally, after trying to calm this kid down, maybe like 3 or 4 times, I stopped. I pulled the father aside. I said, hey, what do you feed this kid? When did he go to bed? I just began to dialogue with him. And he said, well, I mean, he goes to bed when he's tired, like it's at night. I mean, whenever he falls asleep, we're like watching movies at night. I'm like, what movies are you watching? Something a child shouldn't have been watching. And then the parent said, and I get him breakfast before I come here. I just take him to McDonald's, because his mom doesn't make food. And I just was like, okay, whoa, you need to unplug from your life. You've got to replug into the Lord. So it was a dialogue for the parent. And then we dialogued with how they've got to change their life, get on a structure. They've got to eat differently. Their children has to. Listen, this man, it took a while. We had to dialogue with him. He went and said yes to this, yes to loving God, yes to loving himself and being healthy, yes to taking care of his child. His child was amazing after that. We got him off of the fast food. We got him plugged into the Lord. He went to bed on time. The father, because all this structure began to come in his life, here's what happened. He actually went out, went back and grew deeper in the Lord, went back and got his degree. He's now pastoring. His child is doing amazingly well. This is 10 plus years later. So the Lord did an amazing work, and it really was not it was a lot of work, but I was just trying to be faithful to go after this. And it might have looked like it was a lost cause. However, we sat down and dialogued, and the whole family turned around. They're beautiful, beautiful people. So first of all, we want to understand that Satan is always tempting us. And so I'm back into my temptation thing. So that's just, we've pushed play. We've talked about how you've really got to live a different lifestyle. And then now we're back into talking about temptation. Again, we talk about what is evil desire, inward sin, outward sin, pain. And now we're talking about Satan wants to disrupt your whole life. And he's seeking of how to bring temptation. I have a little dialogue on page 60. It's kind of like, it's make-believe. It's about, Satan, I'm just going to read it to you. It's, God saying this. It's a dialogue between God and Satan about me. And so it's just imaginatory, but Satan, God's like, hey, what are you doing today? And Satan says, well, Ben fell into temptation, therefore I want to mess up his life. I'm going to start by trying to disqualify him, and I'm going to do this in 3 ways. Firstly, I'm going to convince him that you're mad at him, God, and that his future is going to be a failure. Secondly, I'll convince him people don't like him. And thirdly, I'm trying to convince him that his identity is not as you see it. So this is how the Lord, Satan goes after us. First of all, he's like, God doesn't like you. Secondly, people don't like you. And thirdly, your identity is not how God sees you. Your identity is how the world or the culture or what have you. And that's really what Satan does. He does it all the time. He tries to do this all the time. He's just a liar. But we want to understand we overcome. How do we overcome? Revelation chapter 12, verse 11, the end of page 60 in Firm Foundations, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. We don't even love our lives, even unto death. And so we want to talk about being made new. I have a whole bunch of scriptures. We talk about David, who is a man after God's own heart. He made a bunch of mistakes. However, the first thing written about him, the last thing written about him, is that he was a man after God's own heart. David was someone who was pursuing and seeking after the Lord. And it says, Paul writes later through Acts, he was a man after God's own heart, and he did God's will. So we want to help your child understand that temptation will come and they can overcome, just like David did, and just like you. Maybe this is where you share a story of overcoming a temptation. Okay, then we've got on page 62, we've got questions that they can go through. Again, just depending on the age of your children, which one you will do and which one you can dialogue with your family on. And then pray with them at the end. Pray with them to be strengthened to overcome temptations. And let's just pray right now, actually. Father, I pray as the parents reach out to their children, the parents will overcome temptation. I pray for dads to overcome the temptation, the struggles. Moms overcome the temptations that are out there. And I pray for families to overcome together. Actually, just want to share, I really feel as your families are coming together in this section, holding hands and saying, God, help us. There's going to be times when dads and moms are sharing struggles and how they overcame, asking for forgiveness. Families are going to be healed and they're going to overcome. Satan grows in darkness. If we don't share, things just begin to multiply. If we don't tell and train our children to overcome temptation, it kind of begins to multiply. So live. This is what I want to end with. Parents, live like you're training your grandchildren. This is a section where you want to train your grandchildren. How would you train your grandchildren? Do it by teaching them to overcome temptation. God bless.